Some encounters change everything, arriving when we least expect them, but exactly when we need them most. In a world that often feels too fast and too loud, there's something deeply moving about two souls finding each other in the quietest corner of the wilderness. Abel is an aging Apache hunter who has walked alone through the Arizona forests for years, carrying grief that never seems to lighten. When he discovers what looks like an abandoned cabin, he finds something unexpected. A young girl named Talitha standing barefoot in the doorway with eyes that seem to hold ancient secrets. She has no family, no explanation for how she came to live alone in the wilderness. Abel feels something stir in his heart that he thought was gone forever. What brought this child to the mountains, and why does her presence change everything for a man who had given up on connection? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ponderosa pines, like memories that refused to fade, and Abel Crow Feather moved through it with the quiet grace of a man who had learned to read the forest's every whisper. His weathered hands, marked by decades of sun and wind, adjusted the worn leather hunting pouch at his side, the same pouch that had carried sage and tobacco through more seasons than he cared to count. At 63, Abel's black hair showed threads of silver, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much sorrow and not enough joy. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around him, a vast canvas of red stone and green forest that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. For 15 years he had walked these mountains alone, tracking deer and elk not for sport, but for sustenance, trading pelts in the distant towns when his supplies ran low. The Apache bands he had once called family seemed like echoes from another lifetime, their voices growing fainter with each passing season. His moccasins made no sound on the pine-needle carpet as he followed an ancient game trail deeper into the wilderness. This part of the forest held an older silence, the kind that settled into a man's bones and reminded him of all the words he had never spoken. Abel preferred it here, away from the settlements, where men looked at him with suspicion, and women clutched their children closer when he passed. The cabin appeared through the trees like a ghost, materializing from the mist. Abel stopped, his hunter's instincts immediately alert. He had traveled this route dozens of times over the years, and no cabin had ever stood in this clearing. Yet there it was, as if it had grown from the earth itself, walls of weathered logs chinked with clay, a roof heavy with moss and fallen branches, a stone chimney that looked older than the territory itself. Abandoned, he thought. Had to be. The windows were dark, their glass clouded with age and grime. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and a wooden bucket sat overturned beside a well that looked like it hadn't drawn water in years. Abel's breath caught in his throat as memories surfaced unbidden. Another cabin, another time. The smell of smoke and the sound of laughter that had once filled his world before it all turned to ash. He shook his head, pushing the memories down where they belonged. This was just shelter, nothing more. A place where some forgotten prospector or trapper had tried to make a life before the wilderness claimed him. Abel had seen dozens of such places in his wanderings, monuments to dreams that died hard deaths in the unforgiving landscape. But something made him pause. Call it instinct, call it the whisper of his ancestors, but something about this place felt different. Not abandoned, not empty, occupied. That's when he saw her. She stood in the doorway like a vision from the spirit world, so still and quiet that for a moment Abel wondered if his aging eyes were playing tricks on him. A child, no more than 11 or 12, with long brown hair that hung loose around her shoulders and bare feet that seemed rooted to the wooden threshold. Her dress was simple homespun cloth, faded blue like a winter sky, and her hands rested calmly at her sides as if she had been waiting for him. But it was her eyes that stopped Abel's heart. Dark and deep as mountain pools, they held a gravity that no child should possess. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the world's cruelty and made peace with it, someone who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. "Hello," Abel said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. He raised his hand in the universal gesture of peace, palm forward. "I didn't know anyone lived here." The girl studied him with those ancient eyes, taking in his Apache features, his traditional clothing, the patient way he held himself. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, measuring his threat against her need for caution. "I'm Abel," he continued, taking a careful step closer. "I was just passing through, following the deer trails." Still, she said nothing, but something in her posture relaxed minutely. She wasn't afraid of him, Abel realized with surprise. Wary, yes, but not afraid. This child had learned to read people the way he read the forest, looking for signs of danger in every gesture and tone. "What's your name?" he asked gently. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then so quietly he almost missed it, she spoke. "Talitha." Her voice was like the first tentative notes of a songbird, unused to being heard. Abel felt something shift in his chest, an awakening of emotions he had buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. When was the last time someone had told him their name? When was the last time he had shared his own? "Talitha," he repeated, letting the syllables roll off his tongue like a prayer. "That's a beautiful name." The ghost of a smile touched her lips, so brief he might have imagined it. But it was there, that flicker of human connection he had almost forgotten how to recognize. "Are your people here?" Abel asked, looking past her into the shadowy interior of the cabin. "Your family?" The smile vanished, and something shuttered in her expression. She shook her head once, a movement so small it barely disturbed her hair. "Just me," she whispered. Abel felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "Just me." The loneliest words in any language, especially when spoken by a child who should never have to claim them. He thought of his own solitary years, the way isolation had carved itself into his soul like water cutting through stone. But he had chosen that path. This child, what had driven her to it? "How long have you been here?" he asked. Talitha's brow furrowed in concentration, as if the concept of time had become fluid for her. "Long enough," she said finally. Abel nodded, recognizing the weight of those words. He had said the same thing many times when people asked about his years in the wilderness. Long enough for the world to forget you exist. Long enough to forget you exist yourself. Are you hungry? The question came without conscious thought, rising from some deep well of compassion he thought had run dry. "I have jerky, some pine nuts." For the first time since he had appeared in her clearing, Talitha's composure cracked. Her hand went unconsciously to her stomach, and Abel saw the hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals. She was surviving, but just barely. "I could share," he added quietly. "If you'd like the company." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Abel waited, understanding instinctively that this moment would define everything that followed. Push too hard, and she would disappear into the forest like smoke, but offer just enough trust to kindle her own. And perhaps they could find something worth holding on to, finally. Talitha stepped back from the doorway, a gesture so small it might have been meaningless to anyone else. But to Abel, it was an invitation into a world that had been closed to him for far too long. He followed her into the cabin, ducking under the low lintel, and was struck immediately by how clean and organized everything was. This was no abandoned shelter, but a carefully maintained home. A few cooking pots sat neatly arranged on a rough wooden table. A small pallet in the corner was covered with a quilt that, while faded, was free of dust and debris. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and wild mint. On the table, almost hidden beneath a small cloth, sat a wooden doll. Its paint was faded, and its dress showed signs of careful mending, but it was clearly treasured. Abel pretended not to notice when Talitha quickly moved to cover it completely. "You've made a good home here," Abel said, settling onto a rough stump that served as a chair. He pulled his hunting pouch into his lap and began to withdraw strips of jerky and a small bag of pine nuts. "Very peaceful." Talitha remained standing, watching him with those knowing eyes. "Where do you live?" she asked. Abel paused in his unpacking. Where did he live? He had sleeping places scattered throughout the territory, caves and shelters he had built over the years, but none of them felt like home. "Wherever the trail takes me," he said finally. "I've been wandering for a long time. Why?" The simple question cut straight to the heart of everything he had been running from. Abel looked up at this child who spoke so few words, but asked the ones that mattered most. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "a man finds himself in a place where staying hurts more than leaving." Talitha nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "I know that place," she said quietly. Abel felt something in his chest tighten. Of course she knew. Whatever had brought her to this isolated cabin, whatever had made her a child, raising herself in the wilderness, it had been born from that same terrible mathematics of pain. He held out a piece of jerky, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing food and presence in the way that lonely people do when they recognize kindred spirits. Outside, the mist continued to drift between the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it hunted. As the morning wore on, Abel found himself studying this remarkable child who had somehow carved out an existence in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. She moved with quiet efficiency, clearly at home in her solitary world, but there was something brittle about her self-sufficiency, as if it had been forged in fire and could shatter at the wrong touch. When the food was gone, Abel expected to feel the familiar pull of the trail, the restless need to move that had driven him for so many years. Instead, he found himself reluctant to leave this sanctuary of silence and shadows. Something about Talitha's presence had awakened an echo of the man he used to be, the one who believed in protecting the innocent and cherishing the vulnerable. "I should go," he said, but made no move to rise. "Should you?" Talitha asked, her head tilted slightly to one side. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Abel had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection, this dangerous opening of the heart that could only lead to loss. But looking at this child, who had somehow survived alone in the wilderness, who carried herself with the dignity of someone far older and wiser, he felt the first crack in the walls he had built around his soul. "Maybe not just yet," he heard himself say, and in that moment, Abel Crowfeather made the first choice in 15 years that wasn't driven by grief or guilt or the need to run from his past. He chose to stay, at least for a little while, in a forgotten cabin with a mysterious child who seemed to understand the weight of solitude better than anyone he had ever met. Outside, the mist began to clear, letting shafts of golden sunlight stream through the windows. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Abel felt something that might have been hope stirring in the depths of his weathered heart. 3 days passed, like water over stone, each one settling Abel deeper into the rhythm of life at the cabin. He had intended to stay only through the first night, but when morning came, Talitha had quietly set a place for him at the small wooden table. The gesture was so natural, so filled with unspoken understanding, that leaving seemed not just impossible, but cruel. He made himself useful in the ways that came naturally to him. The roof needed patching, where winter storms had loosened some shingles. The well required cleaning, its water murky from disuse. Small repairs that spoke of care and permanence. Though neither of them spoke of such things aloud, Talitha watched him work with quiet attention, sometimes helping by holding tools or gathering materials, but more often simply observing. She seemed to be learning him the way she might study a new species of bird, cataloguing his habits, his moods, the careful way he handled everything as if it might break. On the 3rd evening, as Abel reinforced the cabin's door hinges with strips of leather, he noticed something that made his hands still. Scratches in the wood around the lock, fresh enough to catch the lamplight. Someone had tried to force entry, and recently. "Talitha," he said carefully, not looking up from his work. "Have you had visitors?" The silence stretched so long, he began to wonder if she had heard him. When he finally glanced her way, he saw her standing rigid by the window, her face pale in the flickering light. "Bad visitors," she whispered. Abel set down his tools and turned to face her fully. When? Before you came. They rode horses, made a lot of noise. Her hands twisted in the fabric of her dress. I hid in the root cellar until they left. A chill ran down Abel's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Men on horseback searching for something or someone. In his experience, such searches rarely ended well for the searched. Did they say what they wanted? Talitha shook her head, but Abel caught the flash of something in her eyes. Not confusion, but fear. She knew more than she was saying. That night Abel slept lightly, his senses tuned to every sound the forest made. Years of living in the wilderness had taught him to distinguish between the normal settling of wood and earth and the subtle wrongness that came with human presence. Sometime before dawn, he heard it, the distant snap of a branch underfoot, too heavy to be deer, too clumsy to be any natural predator. He rose silently, moving to the window that faced the clearing's edge. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver and shadow. At first he saw nothing, just the familiar shapes of pine and boulder. Then movement caught his eye, a darkness shifting between the trees, a man on foot, trying to move quietly but lacking the skill for true stealth. Abel watched as the figure circled the cabin at a distance, clearly scouting. After several minutes, the shape melted back into the forest, but not before Abel caught a glimpse of something metallic, a gun barrel reflecting moonlight. When morning came, Abel found tracks in the soft earth near the well, boot prints, deep enough to suggest a heavy man. Someone who had spent considerable time studying the cabin, noting its weaknesses and exits. They came back, he said quietly when Talitha emerged from the cabin. She nodded, unsurprised. They always come back. The words carried the weight of experience, and Abel felt something cold settle in his stomach. This child had been living with this threat for how long? Hiding, running, surviving by wit and luck against odds that would have broken grown men. Who are they, Talitha? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Bad men. They hurt people. Did they hurt you? Her hands went unconsciously to her left arm, a gesture so quick he almost missed it. But Abel's trained eye caught the way she favored that side, the careful way she moved it. Old injury, he realized. Badly healed. They hurt my family, she said. The simple statement hit Abel like a physical blow. Her family, of course. This child hadn't chosen solitude. It had been thrust upon her by violence and loss. Just like his own. All of them? He asked gently. Talitha nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but not falling. Mama hid me before they came. Told me to run to the cabin if anything happened. Said someone good would find me here someday. Abel felt something fracture in his chest. A mother's last act of protection, sending her child to safety while facing death herself. The courage it must have taken, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would care enough to help. How long ago? When the leaves were turning, she whispered. Months then. This child had survived an entire winter alone, living on whatever she could forage or trap, always knowing that the men who had destroyed her world were still looking for her. What do they want with you? Abel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Talitha's face went very still, and for a moment she looked far older than her years. I saw something I shouldn't have seen. Abel closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him. A witness? This child was a witness to something terrible, something worth killing for. The men tracking her weren't just killers. They were killers with something to lose. He opened his eyes and looked at Talitha, really looked at her. Beneath the surface calm, beneath the preternatural composure, he saw what he should have recognized from the beginning. Not just a child who had survived tragedy, but a child living under a sentence of death. We need to talk about what you saw, he said quietly. She shook her head, backing away. Can't. Mama made me promise never to tell anyone, even if it meant staying safe, especially then. Her voice carried the absolute conviction of a child who had been given a sacred charge. She said telling would just make more people die. Abel felt the familiar weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. He could pack his few belongings and disappear back into the wilderness, leaving Talitha to whatever fate awaited her. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that wouldn't end with more graves and more grief, or he could stay. He could make himself a target alongside this child who had already lost everything. He could let himself care about someone again, with all the terrible vulnerability that caring brought. He thought of his own family, lost to violence, and his failure to protect them. The guilt that had driven him into 15 years of exile. The weight of survival when those he loved had not survived. This felt like an echo of that terrible night. Another chance to choose between safety and sacrifice. But this time was different. This time he wasn't too late. Your mother was a wise woman, Abel said finally. But she sent you here to be safe, not to face this alone. I'm not alone now, Talitha said, and the simple trust in her voice nearly broke his heart. Abel knelt down so he was at her eye level, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. No, he said, you're not alone. And those men, they'll have to go through me to get to you. Something in her expression shifted, a wall cracking to let in the first ray of hope she had allowed herself in months. You'll stay. I'll stay, Abel promised, and felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. For as long as you need me to. That afternoon, Abel began preparing the cabin for siege. He had been a warrior once, before grief had turned him into a hermit. The skills were still there, rusty but intact. He reinforced the door and shuttered the windows. He cached water and supplies in the root cellar Talitha had mentioned. He scouted the surrounding forest, marking trails and escape routes. As the sun set on their fourth day together, Abel found himself looking at their small sanctuary with new eyes. Not just a forgotten cabin in the wilderness, but a fortress. A place worth defending, a home worth fighting for. And for the first time in 15 years, Abel Crowfeather felt like he had something worth dying for. Something more importantly worth living for. The war for Talitha's life was about to begin, and Abel intended to win it. Whatever the cost. The medicine bundle felt foreign in Abel's hands after so many years of disuse. He unwrapped the sacred buckskin carefully, revealing the collection of items that connected him to his Apache heritage and the healing traditions of his people. Eagle feathers, blessed stones, herbs for cleansing, all the tools his grandmother had taught him to use before the world changed, and he had learned to trust only in solitude. Talitha watched from across the cabin as he arranged the contents on the rough wooden table, her dark eyes following his every movement with careful attention. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Medicine," Abel said, though he knew the word carried different meanings for his people than it did for the white world. Healing, protection, ways of asking for help from those who came before us. He selected a small bundle of sage and lit it with a splinter from the fire, letting the sweet smoke curl upward toward the rafters. The familiar scent transported him back decades, to a time when he had believed in the power of ritual to keep the darkness at bay. "My grandmother taught me these things when I was not much older than you," he said, wafting the smoke toward each corner of the cabin. "She said that every place needs blessing, especially places where people plan to make a stand." "Are we making a stand?" Talitha asked. Abel paused in his cleansing ritual, considering the weight of her question. "Yes," he said finally, "we are." Over the following days, Abel threw himself into preparation with the focused intensity of a man who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. He reinforced the cabin's walls from the inside, driving wooden stakes between the logs to create firing ports that would allow them to defend the structure without exposing themselves. He dug shallow trenches around the perimeter, filling them with sharpened stakes and covering them with brush, not enough to stop determined men, but sufficient to slow them down and announce their approach. Each modification was made with Talitha's help. And Abel found himself explaining not just what he was doing, but why. She absorbed every lesson with the focused attention of someone who understood that her survival might depend on remembering these details. "The forest is our ally," he told her as they camouflaged. "One of his defensive positions. These men, they're used to towns and roads. They think in straight lines and open spaces. But here, everything curves. Everything hides. If we move like the forest moves, we become part of it." Talitha nodded seriously. "Like being invisible." "Like being home," Abel corrected. When you truly belong somewhere, you don't need to be invisible. You just need to be yourself. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden, images of another time, another place where he had made similar preparations. A small cabin in the Dragoon Mountains, where he had lived with his wife Maria and their 2 children, where he had been teaching his son the same skills he was now sharing with Talitha, passing down the warrior traditions that had kept the Apache alive for centuries. The attack had come at dawn, just like this one probably would. A patrol of cavalry soldiers who had mistaken their peaceful homestead for a hostile camp. Abel had been away, tracking a wounded deer when the shooting started. By the time he returned, smoke was rising from the cabin, and his family lay still in the dirt of their own yard. He had buried them with his bare hands, wrapped in the very blankets where they had once slept safely. Then he had walked away from everything that had defined him. His role as husband, father, teacher, protector. He had failed at all of them, and the guilt had hollowed him out like fire, consuming a dead tree. Abel. Talitha's voice brought him back to the present. She was standing beside him, looking up with concern. "You went away." He realized he had stopped working, his hands clenched around a piece of rope. "Sometimes the past comes visiting whether we want it or not," he said. "I know about that too," she said quietly. Of course she did. This child carried her own ghosts, her own weight of loss. But where his had driven him to isolation, hers had somehow made her stronger. There was a resilience in Talitha that humbled him, a capacity for hope that his years of bitterness had nearly eroded from his own heart. "Tell me about your family," he said gently, settling onto a stump to take a break from their preparations. Talitha was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers tracing patterns in the dirt at her feet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful cadence of someone reciting something precious. "Mama was a teacher. She came from back east to teach the children in Tucson. Papa was a rancher. He raised horses and cattle on our land, near the Santa Cruz River." She looked up at Abel. "They met at a church social. Papa said Mama was the prettiest woman in the territory, and smart as a whip besides." Abel felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "Sounds like a good match." "They were happy," Talitha continued. "Mama would read to me from her books every night. Stories about places far away, adventures and brave people who did the right thing even when it was hard. Papa taught me to ride and rope, said I had natural hands for handling horses. What happened to them?" The light went out of her eyes like a candle being snuffed. "The bad men came looking for something. They thought Papa knew where it was hidden. When he told them he didn't know, they got angry. They hurt Mama to try to make him tell. But Papa really didn't know, and Mama—" Her voice broke. Abel reached out and gently took her hand. "You don't have to say it all at once." She squeezed his fingers gratefully. "I was in the loft when they came. Mama had made me promise that if strangers ever rode up angry, I should hide and stay hidden no matter what I heard. She said adults sometimes did terrible things to each other, but children didn't need to see it all. But you saw enough. Too much," she whispered. "After they left, I tried to help, but Mama and Papa were already gone. Mama had told me about this cabin, said it was where she came when she needed to think. She made me memorize the way here just in case." Abel felt something break inside his chest. This child had not only witnessed the murder of her parents, but had been forced to find their bodies, to face the reality of their death alone. That she had found the strength to follow her mother's final instructions, to make her way to this remote sanctuary and survive for months on her own. Spoke to a courage that put his own to shame. "Your parents raised a remarkable daughter," he said quietly. "I don't feel remarkable. I feel scared most of the time." "Being scared doesn't make you less brave," Abel said. "It just makes being brave harder. And you've been doing the hard thing for a long time now." As the days passed, Abel found himself sharing his own stories in return. Not the painful ones, not yet, but the earlier memories. His childhood among the Apache. The lessons his grandfather had taught him about tracking and hunting. The pride he had felt when he earned his warrior name. Talitha listened to these tales with the hungry attention of someone who had been starved for connection. She began to trust him with small confidences, her favorite hiding places around the cabin, the names she had given to the various birds and squirrels that visited their clearing, her fears about the coming winter and whether she would be strong enough to survive it alone. But she wouldn't be alone now, Abel reminded himself. Whatever came, they would face it together. The thought should have terrified him, this return to caring about someone else's welfare. Instead, he found it gave weight and meaning to his days in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. The war might be coming, but for now, in the quiet hours between preparation and vigilance, they were building something more precious than any fortress. They were building trust, understanding, and the first fragile bonds of a family chosen rather than born. Abel discovered Talitha's journal by accident, tucked beneath her pallet when he was helping her reorganize the cabin's limited storage space. The small, leather-bound book fell open as he lifted her blanket, revealing pages filled with detailed pencil drawings and carefully formed letters. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, moving to close it without looking. "I didn't mean to—" "It's all right," Talitha said quietly. "You can look if you want." The trust in her voice humbled him. Abel settled back on his heels and gently turned the pages, studying the remarkable artwork within. There were sketches of birds in flight, their wings captured in perfect detail, landscapes showing the cabin from different angles, the surrounding forest rendered with an artist's eye for light and shadow. And scattered throughout, words written in a careful script that spoke of hours spent practicing by lamplight. "These are beautiful," Abel said, genuinely amazed. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" "Mama taught me." She said art was another way of remembering, like keeping the important things safe in pictures so they couldn't get lost. Talitha settled beside him on the wooden floor. She was going to send away for real art supplies when we had enough money saved up. Abel turned another page and found himself looking at a portrait that made his breath catch. A woman with kind eyes and gentle features, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. The love in every carefully drawn line was unmistakable. "Your mother," he said softly. "I drew that from memory after she was gone. I was afraid I might forget what she looked like." Talitha's finger traced the edge of the portrait. "Do you think it's silly trying to hold on to people with pictures?" "No," Abel said firmly. "I think it's one of the wisest things a person can do." He thought of his own family, how their faces had grown hazier in his memory over the years. He had no pictures of them, no physical reminders beyond the pain their loss had carved into his heart. What he wouldn't give now for what Talitha had created, these tangible connections to love that death couldn't completely sever. They spent the afternoon together, Talitha showing him more of her artwork, while Abel shared what he remembered of his grandmother's teachings about memory and healing. There were drawings of her father, too, captured with the same loving attention to detail. Images of their ranch, their horses, the life she had lost, but refused to let fade completely. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Abel found himself opening up about his own family for the first time in years. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but Talitha's patient attention made them easier to speak. "I had a son about your age," he said. "Joseph. He was learning to track, wanted to be a warrior like his grandfather. And a daughter younger, Sarah. She had her mother's laugh, bright as bells ringing. What happened to them?" Abel was quiet for a long time, watching the last light filter through the cabin windows. "Men came to our place too. Soldiers who thought we were hostile because we chose to live apart from the reservation. They didn't bother to ask questions before they started shooting." Talitha reached over and took his hand, the same gesture of comfort he had offered her. "I'm sorry. I blame myself for a long time. Still do, if I'm honest. I was their protector and I failed them. Were you there when it happened?" "No, I was hunting." "Then how could you have protected them?" The simple logic of her question cut straight through years of self-recrimination. Abel looked at this child who had survived horrors that would have broken adults, who had found the strength to keep going when every reason to quit had been taken from her. "You're very wise for someone so young," he said. "Mama always said that hard things make you grow up fast, whether you want to or not." Over the following days, their conversations deepened. Abel found himself sharing not just the tragedy of his loss, but the good memories too. The joy his children had brought him, the quiet contentment of his marriage, the sense of purpose that had once defined his days. Talitha listened to it all with the gravity of someone who understood that these stories were gifts, pieces of himself he was choosing to trust her with. In return, she began to reveal more about her own experiences, the months of survival after her parents' death, the techniques she had developed for staying hidden when strangers passed through the area, the way she had learned to read the forest's moods and weather patterns, becoming part of the wilderness in a way that would have impressed even his Apache elders. "The animals taught me a lot," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "They know how to be still when they need to be still, how to move when they need to move, how to tell the difference between real danger and just being scared of shadows. And what about when the danger is real?" Abel asked. "Then you get very small and very quiet and you wait for your chance." Abel felt a chill run down his spine. This child had learned lessons about survival that no 11-year-old should need to know. But there was no self-pity in her voice, just the calm acceptance of someone who had adapted to reality without letting it crush her spirit. As they prepared for sleep that night, Abel realized how much their relationship had shifted over the past weeks. What had begun as a chance encounter between strangers had evolved into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Talitha no longer flinched when he moved suddenly or spoke loudly. Abel no longer weighed every word, afraid of saying something that might drive her away. They had become a family of sorts. Two survivors who had found in each other what they thought they had lost forever, someone worth protecting, someone worth trusting, someone who made the daily choice to keep living feel like something more than mere stubbornness. But even as this fragile bond strengthened, Abel remained acutely aware of the danger that stalked them. He found fresh tracks around the cabin's perimeter every few days, evidence that their hunters were growing bolder. The men were learning the terrain, mapping escape routes, studying their habits from a distance. "They're patient," he told Talitha one morning as they examined boot prints near the well. "That makes them more dangerous, not less. How long do you think before they try something?" Abel studied the tracks, noting their depth and spacing. Multiple men, armed, confident enough to approach closer than before. "Soon," he said. "They're running out of patience, and patient men who run out of patience tend to make big moves." That night, as they secured the cabin for sleep, Abel found himself looking at Talitha with new eyes. She had grown stronger over their weeks together, but she was still a child facing adult dangers. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden, but this time it felt different. This time he was choosing it freely rather than having it thrust upon him. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these weeks have been the best I've had in 15 years. Talitha looked up from where she was banking the fire. "For me too," she said simply, and in that moment Abel understood that he had found something worth fighting for again. Not just Talitha's life, but the life they were building together, the family they were choosing to become against all odds and in the face of all dangers. The storm was coming, but they would weather it together. Of that at least he was certain. The silver locket lay in Abel's palm like a piece of fallen starlight, its surface tarnished but still beautiful. Talitha had retrieved it from a hiding place beneath a loose floorboard, her movements careful and reverent as she placed the precious object in his weathered hands. "Mama gave this to me before she hid me in the loft," she said quietly. "She said it would help people know who I really am if something happened to her and Papa." Abel opened the delicate clasp with gentle fingers, revealing a small photograph inside. A young couple stood together in formal dress, the woman's face unmistakably Talitha's mother, but the man beside her was not the rancher she had described. This man wore a badge on his vest and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Who is this?" Abel asked, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten with understanding. "Papa's brother," Talitha whispered. "Uncle Marshall." Mama said he was important, worked for the territorial government in Phoenix. She said if anything ever happened to Mama and Papa, I should find him and show him the locket so he'd know I was family. Abel studied the photograph more carefully, noting the family resemblance between the two men. But there was something else in the marshal's eyes, something that made Abel's warrior instinct stir with unease. Did your parents ever talk about your uncle? About what kind of work he did? Talitha's brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes. Papa would get letters from him, and they'd make Papa worry. Mama would tell him not to get involved in Marshall's business, that it was too dangerous. But Papa said family was family, and you help family, even when it was hard. The pieces began falling into place in Abel's mind like stones settling into a riverbed. A territorial marshal with dangerous business. A rancher brother who got worried letters. A family destroyed by men looking for something hidden. And now a child carrying proof of her connection to someone powerful enough to matter. Talitha, Abel said carefully, what exactly did the men who came to your ranch say they were looking for? She was quiet for a long moment, her small hands twisting in her skirt. They kept asking Papa where Uncle Marshall had hidden the papers. They said Uncle Marshall had told someone before he died that Papa knew where the evidence was. But Papa kept saying he didn't know anything about any papers. Abel felt the world shift around him. This wasn't just about witness testimony, this was about evidence. Documents that could implicate powerful people in territorial corruption. Marshall Thompson hadn't just been doing dangerous work. He had been documenting it, building a case that had gotten him killed. Your uncle is dead, that's what the men said. They told Papa that Uncle Marshall had been shot by road agents, but they knew he'd hidden important papers somewhere before he died. They thought Papa knew where, but he didn't. No, Papa and Uncle Marshall had a fight last time we saw him. Uncle Marshall wanted Papa to take me and Mama somewhere safe, said there were bad people in the territorial government who would hurt anyone who got in their way. Papa said he wasn't running from his own land, and they argued something fierce. Uncle Marshall left angry, and that was the last time we saw him. Abel closed the locket carefully, his mind racing through the implications. Talitha wasn't just a witness to her parents' murder. She was the niece of a dead federal marshal who had been building a corruption case. The men hunting her weren't just covering up a crime. They were protecting what sounded like a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial authority. Do you know what your uncle's papers might have said? Talitha shook her head. But Mama said Uncle Marshall was trying to stop bad people from stealing land and money that belonged to regular folks. She said he was brave, but maybe not very smart about who he could trust. Abel felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of choices that carried consequences far beyond his own life. He had fled from such complications once before, choosing isolation over involvement, safety over responsibility. But looking at Talitha's trusting face, he knew he couldn't make that choice again. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Abel waited, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. The night they came for Mama and Papa, I heard one of the men talking outside. He said they had to find me because I was the only one left who could identify them. He said Uncle Marshall had shown me pictures of the bad men, warned Papa about them. Had he? Shown you pictures? Talitha nodded reluctantly. Uncle Marshall came to visit last spring. He had photographs of men he said were dangerous, said if I ever saw any of them near our ranch, I should hide and tell Papa right away. He made me look at each picture until I could remember all their faces. Abel felt his blood turn to ice. This child wasn't just connected to a corruption case. She was the only living witness who could identify the conspirators. No wonder they had been so determined to find her. No wonder they kept coming back. How many men were in the pictures? 5. Uncle Marshall said they called themselves the Territorial Development Company, but they were really just thieves who used their government positions to steal land from farmers and ranchers. And you recognized some of them when they came to your ranch? 3 of them, she whispered, including the leader. Uncle Marshall had said he was the most dangerous because he was smart and had friends in high places. Abel stood up abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the forest. The scope of what they were facing hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just killers. They were connected, organized, and desperate. Men with resources and political protection who had already committed multiple murders to protect their secret, Abel. Talitha's voice was small and scared. Does this change things? Are you going to leave now that you know how bad it is? He turned back to her, seeing the fear in her eyes that he would abandon her now that he understood the true magnitude of the danger. The same fear that had probably driven her to keep these crucial details to herself for so long. No, he said firmly. This doesn't change anything about us. If anything, it makes it more important that we stick together. But even as he spoke the words, Abel felt the weight of their situation pressing down like a stone. They weren't just hiding from vengeful killers. They were standing against a conspiracy that had already destroyed everyone else who had threatened it. The odds were overwhelming, the enemy powerful and ruthless. Yet looking at Talitha, at this brave child who had survived months of terror and still found the courage to trust him with the truth, Abel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just determination, but purpose. A reason to fight that went beyond mere survival. His uncle had died trying to expose corruption and protect innocent people. Her parents had died refusing to betray family secrets they didn't even possess. Now it fell to an aging Apache warrior and an 11-year-old girl to see that their sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The war they faced was bigger than he had imagined, but that just meant the victory would be more meaningful. And for the first time since his own family's death, Abel Crowfeather felt ready to be the warrior he had once been, not for glory or revenge, but for justice and the protection of the innocent. The locket felt warm in his hand as he returned it to Talitha, and with it came the weight of all the lives that depended on their courage. They would not face this darkness alone, and they would not face it as victims. They would face it as family. The war lance stood propped against the cabin wall like a ghost from Abel's past, its wooden shaft worn smooth by countless hands, and its steel point still sharp enough to draw blood. He hadn't touched it in 15 years, hadn't even looked at it directly since the day he'd hidden it away with the other remnants of his warrior life. But now, with danger circling closer each day, the old weapon called to him like an echo of thunder across distant mountains. Talitha found him standing before it just after dawn, his weathered hands hovering inches from the shaft, as if afraid of what might happen if he actually made contact. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, studying the intricate beadwork that decorated the lance's upper section. "Did you make it?" "My grandfather did, for my vision quest, when I became a man." Abel's voice carried the weight of decades. In the old days, a warrior's lance was more than a weapon. It was a promise to protect the innocent, to stand between the people and their enemies, no matter the cost. Why did you stop carrying it? The question cut straight to the heart of everything Abel had been avoiding for half his adult life. He closed his eyes, remembering the last time he had held this lance in battle, the last time he had believed in his ability to protect anyone. "Because I failed," he said simply. "The most important battle of my life, and I wasn't even there to fight it." Talitha moved to stand beside him, her small hand reaching out to touch the lance's shaft without fear or hesitation. "Maybe you weren't there for that battle because you were meant to be here for this one." Her words hit him like a revelation. Abel looked down at this remarkable child who seemed to understand truths that had eluded him for years. Perhaps his failure to save his first family hadn't been the end of his story as a protector. Perhaps it had been preparation for this moment, this choice, this chance to make his life count for something again. "The men who are hunting us," Abel said slowly, "they won't come quietly. When they finally decide to act, it will be with violence and the intention to leave no witnesses." "I know," Talitha said. "I've known since the night they killed Mama and Papa. Are you afraid?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes, but not of dying. I'm afraid of them winning. Of Uncle Marshall's sacrifice meaning nothing. Of the bad men getting away with everything they've done." Abel felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he had kept locked for too long. This child's courage shamed his own fears. Her determination to see justice done, even at the cost of her own safety, reminded him of what it meant to be truly brave. "Tell me about that night," he said gently. "The night your parents died. I need to understand exactly what we're facing." Talitha was quiet for a long moment, gathering strength for a story she had never told in full. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft, like someone reciting a prayer. "They came just before sunrise. 5 men on horseback riding hard like they were chasing something. I was already awake. I'd been having bad dreams about Uncle Marshall for weeks, ever since Papa got the letter saying he was dead. Mama heard the horses first and woke Papa. She told me to get in the loft and stay quiet no matter what I heard." Abel listened without interruption, letting her tell the story at her own pace. "I climbed up through the trapdoor and pulled it closed behind me, but I could see through the cracks between the floorboards. Papa went to the door with his rifle, but he didn't point it at them. He was trying to be neighborly, asking what brought them out so early. The leader, the one from Uncle Marshall's pictures, he was all polite at first, said they were sorry for his loss, sorry about his brother getting killed by road agents. But they weren't really sorry. No. The leader said Uncle Marshall had been carrying important papers when he died, documents that belonged to the territorial government. He said Uncle Marshall had told someone before he was killed that Papa knew where the papers were hidden. Papa kept saying he didn't know anything about any papers, that he and Marshall hadn't even been talking much lately." Talitha's voice began to waver, but she pressed on. "That's when they got mean. The leader said they knew Papa was lying, that family was family, and Marshall would have trusted Papa with something that important. They started threatening Mama, saying they'd hurt her if Papa didn't tell them what they wanted to know." Abel felt his hands clench into fists. The familiar rage was building in his chest, the old warrior's fury at those who would harm the innocent. Papa got angry then. He raised his rifle and told them to get off his land. But there were 5 of them and only 1 of him, and they were ready for trouble. The shooting started so fast I couldn't tell who fired first, but Papa went down right away. Mama screamed and ran to help him, and that's when she stopped, unable to continue. Abel reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "I saw enough," she whispered. "I saw their faces when they did it. I heard them talking after, planning to make it look like road agents had done it. The leader said they had to find me because I was the only one who could connect them to Uncle Marshall and his investigation, but you stayed hidden until they rode away. Then I climbed down and tried to help, but Mama and Papa were already gone. I buried them in the little cemetery where Papa's parents are buried, said words over them like Mama taught me. Then I packed what I could carry and came here like Mama had always said to do if something terrible happened." Abel felt a profound respect for this child who had faced such horror with such dignity. To lose her parents to violence, to bury them with her own hands, to survive months of exile while killers hunted her, and still retain her capacity for trust and hope. She was stronger than many warriors he had known. "The leader," Abel said. "Could you recognize him again?" "Every line of his face. Uncle Marshall made me study those pictures until I could draw them from memory. He said knowing your enemies was the first step in defeating them. Your uncle was a wise man. He was brave, but maybe too trusting. Papa always said Marshall believed too much in the law, thought the system would protect good people if you just had enough evidence. But the system was part of the problem." Abel nodded grimly. He had seen enough of the white man's justice to know that law and justice were not always the same thing. Sometimes justice required stepping outside the law's protection and taking responsibility for setting things right. "These men," he said, "they've killed a federal marshal, murdered your parents, and now they're hunting a child. They've gone too far to turn back, which means they'll keep coming until we stop them. How do we stop 5 men with guns and government connections?" Abel reached out and finally grasped his grandfather's lance, feeling the weight of it settle into his hands like a promise coming home. The familiar balance, the smooth, worn grip, the whisper of ancient power that had once made him formidable in battle. We become something they're not prepared to face, he said. They expect to find a frightened child hiding in the wilderness. Instead, they're going to find a warrior defending his family. Talitha looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. Your family? My family, Abel confirmed, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. Whatever else happens, you're not facing this alone anymore. We stand together and we fight together and we win together. That's what family does. Outside, a hawk cried out as it hunted, and somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats echoed through the forest. The enemy was coming, but they would find Abel Crowfeather ready for them. He had found his purpose again, his reason to fight, his family to protect. The war was about to begin, and this time he would not fail. The government document lay spread across the cabin's rough wooden table like a map to hell itself. Its official seals and territorial letterhead lending weight to words that redefined everything Abel thought he understood about their situation. Talitha had retrieved it from another hiding place, a oiled leather pouch sewn into the lining of her coat, and placed there by her mother's careful hands in those final moments before the killers arrived. Mama made me promise to keep this safe, Talitha said quietly. She said it was what Uncle Marshall died for, what Papa died for, and what I might die for if the wrong people found it. Abel studied the document with growing horror, his warrior's mind cataloguing the implications with military precision. It wasn't just evidence of territorial corruption. It was a detailed accounting of a conspiracy that reached from the territorial capital all the way to Washington itself. Names, dates, amounts of money stolen, land fraudulently seized, murders disguised as accidents or road agent attacks. Marshall Thompson didn't just uncover a corruption ring, Abel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He documented a systematic campaign to steal the territory blind and eliminate anyone who got in the way. The list of victims was staggering. Ranchers who had refused to sell their land at below-market prices, found dead in apparent Apache raids that left no survivors to contradict the official story. Town sheriffs who had asked too many questions about missing tax revenues, killed in ambushes, blamed on Mexican bandits. Federal investigators sent from Washington, victims of mysterious accidents that happened just before they could file their reports. Look at this, Abel said, pointing to a section near the bottom of the document. Your uncle wasn't just investigating the Territorial Development Company. He was building a case against Governor Morrison himself. Talitha leaned closer, squinting at the careful script. The governor? But he's supposed to be the good one, the one who's cleaning up the territory. According to this, he's been the one orchestrating everything, using his position to identify valuable land and resources, then arranging for their current owners to have fatal accidents so his associates can buy the properties for nothing and resell them to Eastern investors at enormous profits. Abel felt sick as he read further. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Millions of dollars stolen, hundreds of people murdered, an entire territory held hostage by men who had turned government service into organized crime. And at the center of it all, Governor Morrison, the man Washington trusted to bring law and order to Arizona. There's more, Talitha said quietly, pointing to a sealed envelope that had been tucked inside the document pouch. Abel opened it carefully, revealing a letter in Marshall Thompson's handwriting, dated just days before his death. As he read, his blood ran cold. My dear brother, the letter began, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and the men I have been investigating have silenced me permanently. The enclosed evidence represents 2 years of careful documentation, but I fear it is not enough to bring down the conspiracy that has infected our territorial government. Governor Morrison and his associates have connections in Washington that may protect them even if this evidence reaches the right hands. The letter went on to detail Thompson's growing paranoia in his final weeks, his certainty that someone in his own organization was feeding information to the conspirators. He had trusted no one, shared his evidence with no one, until finally deciding to hide it with his brother's family, as the only people he believed were beyond Morrison's reach. He was wrong about that. Abel said grimly, but he was right about the rest, Talitha replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. This is enough to bring them all down, isn't it? If we could get it to the right people in Washington. Abel looked at this remarkable child who still believed in justice despite everything she had endured. The question is, who are the right people? According to your uncle, Morrison has allies in the federal government. We don't know how far this conspiracy reaches, then what do we do? Before Abel could answer, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Horses, multiple riders moving slowly but steadily toward the cabin. Abel moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 5 men on horseback were spread out in a loose semicircle around the clearing, close enough that their faces were clearly visible in the afternoon light. Abel felt his breath catch as he recognized the leader from Talitha's description, a tall man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. This had to be the head of the Territorial Development Company, the man who had orchestrated the murder of Marshal Thompson and countless others. "They found us," Talitha whispered, but there was no panic in her voice, only the grim acceptance of someone who had been expecting this moment for months. Abel's mind raced as he assessed their situation. 5 armed men against an aging warrior and a child. No chance of escape. They had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious routes out of the clearing. But something about their positioning struck him as odd. They weren't preparing for an immediate assault. They were waiting, crow-feather. The leader's voice carried clearly across the clearing. "We know you're in there, and we know you have the girl. We've come to make you an offer." Abel felt surprise ripple through him. They knew his name. Somehow these men had learned who he was, had researched his background. That suggested resources and connections far beyond what he had imagined. "We know about your family," the voice continued. "We know what happened to them 15 years ago, how you failed to protect them, how you've been running from that failure ever since." The words hit Abel like physical blows, each one precisely calculated to wound. They had done their homework, learned exactly which scars to reopen. "But we also know you were once a great warrior. Respected, feared, effective. We could use a man like that in our organization. Protection, enforcement, problem-solving, work that would pay very well and allow you to use your skills for something more profitable than playing nursemaid to a doomed child." Abel felt Talitha's hand slip into his, her small fingers intertwining with his weathered ones. Whatever they offered him, whatever threats they made, she trusted him not to abandon her. That trust was worth more than any amount of money these men could offer. "All we want is the girl, and whatever papers her uncle left her," the leader called out. "Give us those, join our organization, and you can have a new life. Refuse, and you'll share her fate. We have enough men surrounding this cabin to ensure you never leave it alive." "It's a lie," Talitha whispered. "About having enough men. I counted their horses' tracks yesterday, 5 sets, same as always. They're trying to make you think the odds are worse than they are." Abel squeezed her hand gratefully. Even in this moment of supreme danger, she was thinking tactically, analyzing their enemies' weaknesses. Her uncle and parents had raised a remarkable child. "What do you say, Crowfeather?" The leader shouted. "Do we have a deal?" Abel moved away from the window, gathering the government documents and carefully folding them into his shirt. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had made his choice and would live or die by it. "I say you picked the wrong family to threaten," he called back. "And you picked the wrong warrior to try to buy." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Then the leader's laughter drifted across the clearing, cold and humorless. "So be it. You've chosen to die with her. At least make it interesting." Abel heard the sound of rifles being cocked, saw movement in the tree line as the 5 men took up positions for a siege. They had come prepared for a long battle, confident in their superior numbers and firepower, but they had made one crucial mistake. They thought they were facing a broken old man and a helpless child. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping for 15 years, the warrior spirit of Abel Crowfeather, a man who had once been legend among his people for his ability to turn impossible odds into victory. "Are you ready?" he asked Talitha quietly. She nodded, her young face set with determination that would have done credit to a seasoned fighter. "Whatever happens, they don't get Uncle Marshall's evidence. Whatever it costs us." Abel felt a fierce pride swell in his chest. This child understood what they were fighting for, not just their own lives, but justice for all the innocents who had been murdered to feed the greed of powerful men. The war for Talitha's life was about to begin. But it was bigger than that now. It was a war for the soul of the territory itself, and Abel intended to win it. He reached for his grandfather's lance, feeling the weight of generations settle into his hands. Outside, the enemy waited with patience, born of confidence. They were about to learn that some things were worth dying for, and that a true warrior never faced death alone. Abel spread the hand-drawn tactical map across the cabin floor, his weathered fingers tracing the defensive positions he had spent weeks preparing. Every mark on the rough paper represented hours of careful planning, a convergence of traditional Apache warfare tactics and hard-earned experience from decades of survival in hostile territory. "They think they have us trapped," he said quietly to Talitha, who knelt beside him, studying the map with the focused attention of a seasoned strategist. "But a trap only works if the prey doesn't know it's there." The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's reinforced shutters, casting geometric patterns of light and shadow across their makeshift command center. Outside, the 5 men had settled into patient positions around the clearing's perimeter, confident that time was on their side. They were wrong. "Show me again," Talitha said, pointing to the series of interconnected symbols that marked Abel's defensive network. Abel smiled grimly. This child's ability to understand tactical concepts continued to amaze him. "Here," he said, indicating a cluster of marks near the cabin's eastern wall. "This is where they'll expect us to make our stand, inside the cabin. I'm trying to hold them off until our ammunition runs out, or they burn us out. But we're not staying inside. No, the cabin is just the center of a much larger battlefield." Abel's finger moved across the map, connecting dots that formed a complex web of prepared positions. "Over the past weeks, I've created 8 separate defensive positions throughout the forest around this clearing, camouflaged fighting holes with clear fields of fire, connected by hidden trails that allow movement without being seen." He had drawn on every lesson his grandfather had taught him about asymmetric warfare, every technique the Apache had developed for fighting larger, better-equipped forces. The key was never to engage the enemy where they expected to find you, never to fight on their terms when you could create your own. "Each position has cached weapons and supplies," Abel continued. "Arrows, since gunfire reveals location. Throwing knives. Materials for creating distractions and diversions. If we use them correctly, we can make 5 men feel like they're fighting an entire war party. What if they surrender?" Talitha asked. Abel's expression hardened. "Men like these don't surrender, child. They've killed too many people, stolen too much money, gone too far down a dark path to ever turn back. When cornered, they'll fight like the desperate animals they are." He handed her a small bow he had crafted from mountain ash, perfectly sized for her small frame. "You remember what I taught you about shooting?" She nodded, testing the draw weight. "Aim for center mass. Don't try for fancy shots. Make every arrow count. Good, and if it comes to close fighting." Talitha patted the knife at her belt, a simple but well-balanced blade that Abel had spent hours teaching her to use. "Stay low, stay moving, and remember that I'm smaller and faster than they are." Abel felt a fierce pride swell in his chest. This child had the heart of a warrior, the spirit of someone who would not go quietly into the darkness that men like Morrison and his killers tried to create. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his medicine bundle and withdrawing a small pouch of sage. "My grandmother always said that before a great battle, warriors should cleanse themselves of fear and doubt. Not because courage means feeling no fear, but because true courage means feeling the fear and choosing to act anyway." He lit the sage and let the sweet smoke curl around them both. breathing in the familiar scent that connected him to generations of Apache fighters who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through skill, determination, and an unshakable faith in the righteousness of their cause. Tonight we fight not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has been silenced by these men, Abel said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. We carry the spirits of the fallen with us, and their strength becomes our strength. As the final preparations were completed, Abel found himself looking at Talitha with something approaching wonder. In the span of just a few weeks, she had transformed from a frightened child surviving alone in the wilderness to a young warrior ready to face death alongside him in the name of justice. Her parents and uncle would have been proud beyond words. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Talitha checked her weapons one final time, secured the precious documents against her chest, and looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of doubt or hesitation. "I'm ready," she said simply, and with those words, Abel Crowfeather and Talitha stepped out into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of the cabin that had sheltered them, and walking forward into a battle that would determine not just their fate, but the future of justice in the Arizona Territory. The war had begun, and they would meet it together, as family should, with courage, with purpose, and with an unbreakable bond that death itself could not sever. "About the evidence?" Talitha asked, her hand going unconsciously to where the government documents rested against her chest, sewn into a waterproof pouch and secured beneath her clothing. "That stays with you no matter what happens. If something goes wrong, if I fall, your job is to get to the emergency cache near the old lightning-struck pine and follow the trail we marked to the main road. From there, head to Fort Whipple and find Colonel Harrison. He's the only federal officer your uncle mentioned in his notes as being above suspicion." Talitha nodded seriously, but Abel could see the fear she was trying to hide. Not fear of dying. She had lived with that possibility for months, but fear of being alone again, of losing the family she had found in him. "That's not going to happen," he said gently, reading her expression. "We're going to win this fight, and we're going to walk out of here together. But a good warrior always has a plan for when things go wrong." As the hours passed, Abel made his final preparations with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. He checked each weapon, verified every cache, rehearsed the movement patterns that would allow them to flow through the forest like smoke while their enemies struggled to track targets they couldn't see. But the physical preparations were only part of what needed to be done. The spiritual aspect of warfare had always been equally important to his people, the mental and emotional readiness that transformed ordinary men into warriors capable of extraordinary things. "My grandfather used to say that every battle begins in the heart," Abel told Talitha as they shared what might be their last peaceful meal together. "If you know why you're fighting, if you're certain that your cause is just, then you've already won the most important victory." "Why are you fighting?" she asked quietly. Abel considered the question seriously. "For you first and always, but also for your parents, who died protecting family secrets they didn't even possess. For your uncle, who gave his life trying to expose corruption and protect innocent people. For all the victims whose names are in those documents, people who deserved justice and never got it." He paused, looking out at the forest that had been his home for so many years. "And I suppose I'm fighting for myself too. For the chance to be the protector I failed to be 15 years ago. For the opportunity to make my life count for something before it's over. What if we don't win? Then we make sure our deaths accomplish something," Abel said without hesitation. "Those documents contain enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy. Even if we don't survive to see justice done, we can make certain that our sacrifice ensures it happens eventually." As evening approached, Abel began the final ritual of preparation that his grandfather had taught him before his first battle as a young warrior. He painted his face with traditional symbols using charcoal and clay, each mark carrying spiritual significance and psychological power. The sharp angles and bold lines transformed his weathered features into something fearsome and otherworldly. "You look like a war chief from the old stories," Talitha whispered, awed by the transformation. "That's the idea. When these men see me coming, I want them to understand that they're not facing some broken old hermit. They're facing a warrior with the strength of his ancestors behind him." Abel painted similar markings on Talitha's face, symbols of protection and courage that would remind her of her own strength when the moment came to test it. She bore the unfamiliar decorations with solemn dignity, understanding that she was being initiated into something ancient and powerful. "Tell me about the courage stone," Abel said, noting the smooth river rock she carried in her pocket. Talitha pulled out the polished stone, holding it up to catch the firelight. "I found it the day after I buried Mama and Papa. I was by the creek, crying and feeling like I couldn't go on. This stone was sitting right there in the water, perfectly smooth and warm, even though the stream was cold. When I picked it up, I felt stronger somehow, like it was holding some of their courage for me." "Your parents' spirits chose well," Abel said. "That stone has seen you through the worst of times. Tonight, it will see you through the best of them, the night you helped bring justice to the territory." As full darkness settled over the forest, Abel made his final checks of their defensive network. Each position was exactly as he had left it, each cached weapon ready for use. The enemy had grown complacent during the long afternoon, confident that their quarry had nowhere to run. They were about to learn the difference between being trapped and being prepared. "Remember," Abel said quietly as they prepared to leave the cabin, "we're not trying to kill all of them. We're trying to survive long enough to break their formation and create an opportunity to escape with the evidence. Every shot we take, every move we make, should serve that larger purpose." The courage stone felt warm against Talitha's palm as she crouched in the darkness beside Abel, both of them invisible among the deep shadows cast by a massive ponderosa pine. From their concealed position, they could see the 5 men who had positioned themselves around the cabin, each one confident that their prey was trapped inside the simple log structure. "Remember," Abel whispered, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles. "We move like the forest itself, silent, patient, invisible until the moment we choose to be seen." Talitha nodded, her small fingers tightening around the smooth river rock that had carried her through the darkest months of her young life. Tonight, it would need to carry her through something even more dangerous, not the passive endurance of survival, but the active courage of battle. The leader of the killers stood near the cabin's front door, consulting a pocket watch by moonlight. His patience was clearly wearing thin after hours of waiting for movement from inside. 2 of his men flanked the structure, rifles ready, while the other 2 covered what they believed were the most likely escape routes. Abel had counted on their assumptions, planned around their conventional thinking. These men knew how to hunt ordinary prey, but they had never faced an Apache warrior fighting on ground of his own choosing. "The signal," Abel breathed, so quietly that Talitha felt rather than heard the words. She reached into her pouch and withdrew a small pebble, hurling it with practiced precision toward the cabin's far side. The stone struck the wall with a soft thunk, just loud enough to suggest movement without screaming of deception. The effect was immediate. All 5 men tensed, shifting their positions slightly as they focused on the sound. In that moment of distraction, Abel melted away from their hiding place with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, becoming one with the darkness as he moved toward his first target. Talitha waited, counting heartbeats as Abel had taught her, feeling the courage stone grow warmer in her grip. She thought of her mother, reading to her by lamplight in their lost home. She thought of her father, teaching her to ride with patient hands and gentle words. She thought of Uncle Marshall, dying alone to protect the evidence now sewn against her heart. The first man died without a sound, Abel's knife finding his throat with surgical precision before he could cry out or raise his rifle. The body settled gently to the forest floor, one threat eliminated without alerting the others, but the second target proved more alert. As Abel moved through the undergrowth, a branch betrayed him with the softest whisper of movement. The killer spun toward the sound, rifle rising, mouth opening to shout a warning. That's when Talitha proved that courage could bloom in the smallest heart. Without hesitation, she rose from concealment and sent an arrow singing through the night air. The shaft took the man high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his warning cry into a grunt of pain and surprise. "Contact!" the leader bellowed, his voice echoing across the clearing. "They're in the trees." The battle erupted with sudden violence, muzzle flashes strobing through the darkness as the remaining 3 men opened fire at shadows and movement. But Abel and Talitha were no longer where the killers expected them to be. Flowing through the forest, along paths they had memorized and practiced for weeks, Abel appeared behind the wounded man like a vengeful spirit, his grandfather's lance speaking with ancient authority. The steel point found its mark with deadly precision, and another of Morrison's killers discovered that some debts could only be paid in blood. "Where are they?" the leader shouted, his earlier confidence cracking as he realized that the hunt had become something else entirely. "Spread out! Find them!" But spreading out in unknown territory against invisible enemies was exactly what Abel had hoped they would do. As the 3 surviving killers moved away from each other, they made themselves vulnerable to the kind of tactics that had made the Apache legendary throughout the Southwest. Talitha reached the second prepared position just as Abel had taught her, sliding into the camouflage depression with her bow ready. From here, she had a clear shot at one of the men as he stumbled through the unfamiliar forest. Cursing and swinging his rifle at shadows, the courage stone pulsed with warmth against her palm, and she thought she could feel the spirits of her family standing beside her, lending their strength to her arm as she drew back the bowstring. "For Mama and Papa," she whispered, and released. The arrow flew true, striking the killer in the leg and sending him crashing to the ground with a scream of pain and rage. He was wounded but not dead, still dangerous. But his mobility was gone and his position revealed. Abel materialized from the darkness like justice given form, his war paint making him appear more spirit than man in the shifting moonlight. The wounded killer tried to bring his rifle around, but age and experience triumphed over youth and desperation. 3 down, 2 to go, but the remaining killers had learned from their companions' fates. Instead of continuing to hunt blindly through the forest, they fell back toward each other, using the cabin as cover while they tried to regroup and assess this enemy that fought like no one they had ever faced. "Crow Feather," the leader called out, his voice tight with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "You fight well for a broken old man, but you're only postponing the inevitable." From the darkness, Abel's laugh drifted back, cold and utterly without mercy. "I'm not the one who's broken," he replied, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "And I'm not the one who's about to learn what justice looks like." The hunt continued, but now the roles had reversed completely. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Apache warrior who had found his purpose again was just getting started. The sacred fire flickered to life in the small depression Abel had prepared weeks ago, its flames casting dancing shadows across the clearing where the final confrontation would take place. He had lit it with ceremonial precision, using traditional methods that connected him to the warrior traditions of his ancestors, and marked this moment as something beyond mere violence, a ritual cleansing, a binding of justice. The 2 surviving killers had taken shelter behind the cabin, using its solid walls as protection while they tried to understand what had happened to their carefully planned assault. Their leader still carried himself with arrogant authority, but his companion, a younger man with nervous eyes, kept glancing around the forest as if expecting death to emerge from every shadow. "This ends now, Crow Feather," the leader shouted across the clearing. "You've cost us 3 good men, but you're still outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender the girl and the documents, and I'll make your death quick." From her position in the tree line, Talitha felt the courage stone pulse warm against her palm as she watched Abel step into the firelight with deliberate purpose. His war paint made him appear larger than life, a figure from the old stories when warriors stood between their people and destruction. In his hands, his grandfather's lance caught the flames and seemed to burn with its own internal light. "I am Abel Crow Feather," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "Son of Joseph Running Bear, grandson of Samuel Ghostwalker, great-grandson of the war chief Standing Eagle. You have murdered innocents. You have corrupted justice. You have threatened the child under my protection. For these crimes you will answer." The formal challenge sent chills down Talitha's spine. This was more than a fight. It was a reckoning, a moment when the old ways met the new corruption and demanded satisfaction. The leader laughed, but there was something hollow in the sound. "Pretty words from a dead man. Morrison's people reach all the way to Washington. Even if you kill us, there will be others. The girl will never be safe. Then I'll kill them too," Abel said simply, and began walking forward. The shooting started immediately, both men firing rapidly at the approaching figure. But Abel moved like water flowing around stone, using every bit of cover the clearing provided while advancing with inexorable purpose. Bullets splintered wood and scattered dirt, but none found their mark. That's when Talitha made her own choice to step into the light. She emerged from the forest with her small bow drawn, an arrow nocked and ready. The younger killer saw her first, swinging his rifle toward this new threat, but his movement exposed him to Abel's advance. The war lance flew with deadly accuracy, its steel point taking the man high in the chest and driving him back against the cabin wall. He slid down the rough logs, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers, his eyes wide with the surprise of someone who had never imagined his own mortality. Now it was 1 against 1, and the leader's facade of confidence finally cracked completely. His rifle was empty, his backup weapon forgotten in his growing panic. Abel approached with the patient step of someone who had already won, his movements economical and sure. "You want to know the difference between us?" Abel asked conversationally as he retrieved his lance from the dead man. "You kill for money and power. I kill to protect family." The leader drew a pistol with shaking hands, but before he could fire, Talitha's arrow sprouted from his gun arm. He screamed, dropping the weapon, falling to his knees in the dirt. Abel stood over him, the point of his lance resting lightly against the man's throat. "What's your name?" "Thomas." "Thomas Brennan," the man gasped, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Well, Thomas Brennan, you're going to live long enough to serve one more purpose." Abel's voice was cold as winter wind. "You're going to ride back to your master, Governor Morrison, and you're going to deliver a message." Brennan looked up with desperate hope. "What message?" "Tell him that Abel Crow Feather has the evidence Marshal Thompson died to protect. Tell him that justice is coming for him and everyone connected to the Territorial Development Company. Tell him that he can run, but he can't hide from what he's done. He'll kill me for failing," Brennan whispered. "Maybe, but if you stay here, I'll kill you for what you've already done." "Those seem like better odds to me." Abel stepped back, allowing the wounded man to struggle to his feet. Brennan looked around the clearing at the bodies of his companions, understanding finally the true cost of their corruption. The girl, Abel said firmly, is under the protection of the Apache Nation and the federal government. Anyone who threatens her threatens us all. Talitha stepped up beside Abel, the courage stone now cool in her palm, but her spirit burning bright with triumph. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had won. As Brennan stumbled toward his horse, clutching his wounded arm, Talitha looked up at Abel with something like wonder. "Is it over?" Abel smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had seen on his weathered face. "The fighting is over, but the justice is just beginning." The sacred fire continued to burn, its flames carrying their victory to the spirits of all those who had died for the truth. In the morning they would begin the journey to Fort Whipple, but tonight they were simply family, chosen, tested, and unbreakable. The war was won. The healing could begin. The new beginning blanket lay spread across the cabin floor, its intricate patterns catching the morning light that streamed through windows no longer shuttered against danger. Abel and Talitha had worked on it together throughout the weeks following their victory, their hands learning to weave not just wool and cotton threads, but the bonds of a family chosen through courage rather than born through blood. "The blue represents the sky that carried our prayers," Talitha said, pointing to the azure threads that formed geometric patterns throughout the design. "And the red is for the blood spilled by those who died for justice. Uncle Marshall, Mama, Papa, and all the others," Abel nodded, his weathered fingers tracing the golden threads that spiraled through the other colors like rays of sunlight. "And this yellow is for hope, for the future we're building together." 6 months had passed since the night they faced Morrison's killers in the forest clearing. 6 months since Thomas Brennan had ridden back to Phoenix with Abel's message and the terrible news that the conspiracy had been exposed. The aftermath had been swift and thorough. Arrests, trials, convictions that reached all the way to the territorial capital and beyond. Governor Morrison himself now sat in a federal prison, his political career destroyed by the evidence Marshall Thompson had died to protect. The Territorial Development Company had been disbanded, its stolen assets returned to the families of victims, its surviving members scattered to whatever holes such men crawled into when the light of justice finally found them. But perhaps more importantly, the territory had begun to heal. New leadership had emerged, honest men and women who understood that government service meant protecting people, not preying upon them. The newspapers called it the Great Cleansing, though Abel preferred to think of it simply as the truth finally having its day. A knock at the cabin door interrupted his reflections. Talitha looked up from her weaving with a smile. Visitors no longer meant danger, just the welcome possibility of company and news from the wider world. "Come in, Colonel Harrison," she called out cheerfully. The federal officer who had helped them navigate the complex legal proceedings following their victory stepped into the cabin, his uniform crisp, but his manner relaxed and friendly. Over the months, he had become not just an ally, but a friend, one of the few government officials who truly understood what courage looked like. "Good morning, you two. I hope you're ready for some excellent news." Abel set down his section of the blanket and gestured for the colonel to take a seat at their rough wooden table. "What kind of news?" "The kind that involves federal recognition and a very substantial reward," Harrison said with a grin. "Congress has formally thanked you both for your service to justice in the territory. They're calling you heroes, and they're backing up the praise with action." He withdrew a thick envelope from his coat pocket, setting it on the table between them. "First, there's this. The federal government is offering a reward of $10,000 for your role in exposing the Morrison conspiracy. That's enough to buy land anywhere you want. Set yourselves up for life." Talitha's eyes widened at the astronomical sum, but Abel found himself more interested in what this meant for their future together. "And Second, I have papers here officially declaring Abel Crowfeather to be Talitha's legal guardian, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The territorial court has also ruled that since her parents died without wills, she inherits their ranch and all their property. Which means, young lady, that you're now a very wealthy landowner." Talitha looked at Abel with wonder and not a little fear. "Does this mean, are we really family now? Legally, I mean." Abel felt his throat tighten with emotion as he reached across the table to take her small hands in his weathered ones. "We've been family since the day we chose to trust each other. The papers just make it official." Colonel Harrison smiled at the scene, understanding that he was witnessing something far more valuable than any government proclamation. "There's one more thing. The federal government would like to offer you both a home at Fort Whipple, if you're interested. Abel, they could use someone with your skills training scouts and teaching survival techniques. Talitha, there's an excellent school on the base where you could continue your education." The offer was generous. More than generous. A chance to live safely within the protection of federal authority, to build a new life free from the dangers and uncertainties of frontier existence. But Abel found himself looking around the small cabin that had sheltered them through their darkest hours, at the blanket they were weaving together, at the evidence of the life they had already begun to build. "What do you think?" he asked Talitha quietly. She was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious as she considered their options. "I think," she said finally, "that this cabin is where Mama told me someone good would find me, and someone good did find me. I'd like to stay here, if that's all right with you." Abel felt his heart swell with pride and love for this remarkable child, who understood that home wasn't about safety or comfort. It was about belonging, about being where you were meant to be, with the people you were meant to be with. "Then we stay," he said simply. "We'll fix up your parents' ranch, make it productive again. We'll use that reward money to help other families who've lost everything to corruption and violence. And we'll keep weaving our blanket, adding new colors as our story continues." Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. "I thought you might say that. Well, the offer stands if you ever change your minds. In the meantime, the territorial government has appointed me as the official liaison to ensure your safety and well-being, which is a fancy way of saying I'll be checking in on you regularly, whether you want me to or not." As the colonel prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the unlikely family that had changed the course of territorial history through courage and determination. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there are going to be children reading about you two in history books someday. The Apache warrior and the brave little girl who stood up to corruption and won. They'll learn that sometimes the most powerful people in the world can be brought down by two people who simply refuse to accept injustice." After he left, Abel and Talitha returned to their weaving, adding new threads to their blanket as they talked about their plans for the future. They would rebuild the ranch, create a safe haven for other children who had lost their families to violence. They would tend the graves of her parents and uncle, ensuring their sacrifice was never forgotten. But most importantly, they would continue to be family, not because blood or law demanded it, but because love and choice and shared courage had made it so. The blanket grew beneath their hands, pattern by pattern, thread by thread, a tangible symbol of lives woven together by forces stronger than fear or death. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the stories of loss and redemption that played out in their shadows. And in a small cabin, surrounded by ponderosa pines, an aging Apache warrior and a remarkable young girl continued the most important work of all, building a family, one thread at a time.